If you saw a wax dummy move, would it freak you out? Well, most people in this world are moving dummies anyway, it makes no difference to me. Good morrow, my fellow friends of darkness. I'm Tom and welcome to Monster Gab, where we love to talk about classic and vintage horror, and that includes 80s horror, especially Waxwork from 1988. Here's a question for you, and it's only just occurred to me right now. Are movies based on wax museums or wax dummies a horror subgenre within themselves? I mean, think about it. You've got The House of Wax from 1953, as well as the 2005 remake. Mystery of the Wax Museum from 1933. Nightmare in Wax from 1969. Terror in the Wax Museum from 1973. There was even a silent German movie from 1924 called Waxworks, which was apparently a small inspiration to the movie we're about to review today. The list goes on. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I already feel that wax museums are creepy to begin with, even if they're not horror-based. Surely I'm not the only person that looks at a wax dummy and thinks, God, if that thing moves, I'm gonna freak the hell out. I remember there used to be this wax museum in the Isle of Wight, and they had a horror section there, and nobody cared about seeing Henry VIII or Queen Elizabeth. Everyone just beeline to the horror section, me included, because there's just something creepy about wax dummies. I don't know what it is, but like I said, maybe it's that thought that if they were to move or come alive, then, you know, it would freak you out. And just to add a little more eeriness to the story, we went back to that wax museum in the Isle of Wight only to find that it's no longer there, it's disappeared. Ooh! What a weird noise. So, Waxwork, 1988. This film stars Zach Gilligan, you probably know him from the Gremlins movies. It also stars 80s scream queen Deborah Foreman and David Warner. Not to mention that this is also Anthony Hitchcock's first movie as director. Now, like I said earlier, I did read somewhere online that this movie may have taken inspiration from a German silent movie from 1924, Waxworks. I don't know how true that is, but this movie definitely does take some inspiration from classic horror, especially classic monster movies. It absolutely tips its hat to the universal monster movies like Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, and The Wolfman. I would even say it goes as far as giving a small tribute to The House of Wax from 1953. So here is the synopsis then. A mysterious wax museum appears out of nowhere in the middle of a neighborhood. The museum is used to lure victims in so it can steal their souls and rain evil upon the earth. I mean, that is a very basic synopsis. There is more to the story than that, but that is kind of the meat and potatoes of this film. Right, let's talk about this movie then, because this movie's got a kind of Marmite effect on people. You either love this movie or you hate it. Now, all I'll say is, for those who don't like the movie, I do feel it's kind of misunderstood, and here's why. If you were to look this movie up online, you'll see that it's listed as a horror comedy, and it kind of is, but I would say it's not really a true comedy myself. What this movie is a film that doesn't take itself too seriously. To call it a full-blown comedy wouldn't be fair, because there's many moments in this film where there isn't any humour and you won't be laughing. It's more goofy than funny. Let's put it this way, there were plenty of films in the 1980s that were taking themselves seriously, but they were still kind of cheesy, whether they meant to be or not. And looking back at them now, they may not have dated particularly well, and so they come across as cheesy anyway. Films in the 80s were going through an era, and I feel like Waxwork knew that. They knew they were going through an era and took liberty on it, and like I said, didn't take itself very serious. At least that's my opinion anyway, but I feel like it gives this film this extra charm. It's also a time capsule as well. It really does capture the essence of the 1980s, or at least what we kind of refer to as 1980s anyway. You know, that typical school kids teenage horror essence that you always got with 80s movies, and they're all wearing those thick sunglasses and listening to the music of the time. It really does capture it, and I think it does a good job too. Right, let's talk about the Wax Museum itself, because it's in the middle of a neighborhood. It's the most randomest place to appear, out of nowhere as well. But again, I think this is one of those things where this film knows it's not taking itself seriously. David Warner plays the part of Mr. Lincoln, and he's the owner of this wax museum, and he is brilliant in this film, but I don't want to jump onto the characters just yet. So Mr. Lincoln invites these two schoolgirls who happen to be passing by on their way to school, and invites them to a premiere evening at his exhibition, which is held at midnight. Well, of course it is. It's a horror film. What other time were they going to hold an exhibition? And of course these girls don't think anything weird of it, so they oblige and invite some of their friends. And no more than 6 guests are allowed because, well, it's kind of part of the story. I'm not going to give it away. The museum itself is a horror-based museum, so all of the exhibits are either based on classic horror movies or people from history that were kind of evil. There are 18 exhibits in total that can be seen in this movie, and like I said, they're all kind of horror-based, like Frankenstein, Dracula, etc. But there are things like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Jack the Ripper, there are some zombies, the Marquis de Sade. I mean, talk about Monster Mash. How the soul stealing works is like this. If any of the guests were to step over the rope and into the exhibit, they will actually be part of a scene that the exhibit is trying to portray. For example, let's say they stepped into the Frankenstein exhibit, they will actually be part of a scene of the movie Frankenstein, and then they'll probably be perished and become part of the exhibit. And that's how their soul's stolen, I guess? Something like that anyway. What I find funny about this movie is how so many people feel necessary and obliged to step over the rope and into the exhibit. I mean, sometimes you see the rope fall down and it feels like an invitation, but I mean, if that was you or me, surely you would just kind of say, oh, the rope's fallen down now, pick it back up, or you wouldn't step into the exhibit, surely. Or maybe you would, maybe I'm just the weird one here, I don't know. The characters in the film are quite interesting. Zach Galligan plays the part of Mark, this kind of wealthy rich kid, and he's going through a breakup with one of the characters in the group. It's kind of an unnecessary backstory to the film, but it does get you engaged in the characters and get you to know them better. For instance, he's going through a major breakup with a girl called China, and she appears to be a bit of a gold digger. I get the impression that the reason why she broke up with Mark is because he wasn't willing to splash the cash, so now she's seeing another guy only to make him jealous. Again, it's only a backstory, it's not necessary to the story in the film, but you get to know your characters. Deborah Foreman plays the part of Sarah, who's kind of the goody-goody in the group. You know, she's attracted to Mark, but she doesn't want to date him because he's not the right guy for her. You know, that kind of story. There are other characters as well, and they're all goofy and typical, you know, teenagers that you see in 80s horror. My favourite character, though, is Mr. Lincoln, played by David Warner. He's just so eccentric and so welcoming to his museum, and yet he can be really cruel as well. Obviously, he's trying to lure people into his museum so he can steal their souls, but he's just, as a character, he's just absolutely brilliant. I love him. The special effects in this film are actually pretty good. Granted, this film is kind of dated now, and the effects do look a little dated too, but they're still pretty good for the time. Bob Keane was the effect artist on the monsters in this movie, and it was reported that he worked 18 hours a day for 8 days straight on all of the effects. I mean, talk about overtime. 18 hours a day. There's only 24 hours in a day. That meant he only had 6 hours to eat, to sleep, to poo. But it's true dedication, and I have to say, I really do like the effects in this movie. It's pretty gory, very, very graphic. But then it's a horror movie, so it should be, right? One of the things that I think adds to the charm of this movie is the fact that every single wax figurine can be seen moving one way or another. Yeah, granted, they come to life, but there are moments where they're meant to be still, but they're not. They're either swaying just a little bit, or you can see them breathing, but they're all moving one way or another. Granted, these figurines are meant to come to life, so they have to be played by actors, but why they didn't use genuine wax figurines for when they were still, I don't know. But again, it just goes with the charm, it goes with the cheesiness of the movie, and it works for me. It would be more distracting if this film was taking itself seriously, but because it's not, it's fine. I'm glad that you can see them moving. I think it's brilliant. Despite all of the comedy and the humour, this film still is a horror movie, and it has some moments of tension too. The longest scene in the movie is the vampire scene. So one of the girls, China, steps into the vampire exhibit, and she's invited to sit at a dining table with other vampires. Now, by no means is this film a scary film, but this does have some tension in it. There's no music played during this scene, and it does kind of build a bit of an atmosphere. China is expected to sit at the dining table and eat raw meat with blood. And she does too, and it's pretty gross, to be honest. That being said, I read somewhere that it wasn't really meat, it was just strawberries and rhubarb and watermelon. But hey, it looked good. So without sounding like I'm repeating myself, the biggest reason why I love this movie so much is the fact that it captures the essence of 1980s horror movies, as well as paying homage to classic horror movies from the 30s, 40s and 50s. I wouldn't call it a full-blown comedy, but it's certainly chuckle-worthy in parts and doesn't take itself too seriously. But it's still a horror movie and I totally recommend it. Let's talk about the pros and cons then. Well, the pros are Waxwork from 1988 is highly entertaining. Now, whether you find it funny or not, or whether you find it scary or not, I don't think you're going to find yourself bored throughout the film. From start to finish, it is very, very entertaining. If you like your films gory, it's certainly gory, it's very, very graphic, and it's got some great practical special effects. The characters are fairly interesting, and the soundtrack too is very interesting. In fact, the soundtrack kind of plays an homage to classic horror as well. They use the correct classical pieces that were in the horror movies of the day. For instance, the classic Universal movie The Mummy used a Tchaikovsky piece from Swan Lake as their main theme, and there's a scene in this movie where there's a mummy and they use the same theme in that too. It's just those little fine details that I think are a nice touch. Now, the cons in the movie, for me, are the dubbing seemed a little bit out of sync, or at least the version I watched was. Not all the way through the film, just every now and then the voice wouldn't match the lips, but again, it could have been the version I was watching. It wasn't terrible, but it was noticeable in parts. The acting to me wasn't anything particularly special. I mean, it was fine, but it's the typical acting that you expect in 80s horror. And not that I really want to put this on the con list, but considering that this is still a horror movie, it's not scary. So if you are looking for a scary horror film, perhaps I wouldn't recommend this one. And I suppose for some people this should be on the con list too, the fact that they didn't use real wax figurines, but for me, I think it just adds to the charm of the movie, and I'm glad that they used actors. Right, so to rate this film out of 10, I'm going to give this 7? Yeah, 7 out of 10 I think is fair. I think it's a brilliant film and I highly recommend it, especially if you want to see a classic 80s film. It's not particularly scary, but it's got some great special effects and a bit of humour in it too. This movie did spin a sequel in 1992 called Waxwork 2 Lost in Time, but I haven't seen that one yet. Maybe I should. So folks, have you seen Waxwork from 1988? And if you have, what did you think of it? Did you enjoy it? Did you think it was funny? Did you think it wasn't that funny but it was still a good film and totally worth watching? Please let me know in the comment section. What other Wax Museum based movies do you like? Do you have a favourite? Please do let me know. Which one do you recommend? Speak to me guys in the comment section. I really do want to hear your opinions. And until next time, I don't know who they are, but if you don't subscribe, they will get you. And they said you've got to leave a like and click the notification bell and share with your friends too. I know it's a lot of work, which is why I'm going to leave you to it for now, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.